Alright everybody, welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're reacting, having a discussion about a video from Choy titled 70% of all matches have survived with friends. So, for those of you who sent this, you already know Zaz, and a heck shout out to you, man, for sending this over. This clearly must be important to talk about if both of you guys are sending this over. So I want to jump right in and just see what's up.
Or Survive with Friends accounts for 70% of all matches played in Dead by Daylight. Now, if you are like me, you've probably been told that the vast majority of all of your matches are solo queue, or maybe you saw one of the numerous posts that have circulated for years about how solo queue makes up the vast majority.
This is something that is discussed constantly, is even when I would talk about any balancing topic. I talk about anything recently, as you probably have even seen in recent videos, talking about literally any change at all when it comes to balancing out the survivor side or trying to balance out the game with more mechanics and more things. It always boils down to that the vast majority are not not in SWFs and totally in solo queue. So this is something that I've seen plenty of, and I'm curious to see, you know, if there's any like data we can go off of here.
Of the player base, and killer players specifically just use SWFs as an excuse for their own poor play. However, if you actually look into the truth, it's very different, and it seems this might be a severe community-wide example of the Mandela effect, in large part due to a lot of very manipulative individuals purposely spreading these false stats over the years.
I think they do this to, you know, not to sound like I got a tinfoil hat on, but it does sound like a bit of some kind of like mass form of gaslight to try to dissuade people from really seeing the actual balancing of the game, and to favor you know, whichever side that they think fits their narrative. And I would honestly agree with Choy here that it most likely is the Mandela effect. Maybe at one point it was a lot of solo queue, but nowadays maybe it's not. You know, the game has shifted quite a bit. The game has evolved quite a bit. So if there was a shift from solo queue to a bunch of teams, I really wouldn't be surprised.
And think about it. Okay, if you guessed 2017, you'd be correct. More specifically, October of 2017 was the last official information provided specifically on this topic, so only 5 months in, and 70% of matches contained a SWF, with only 30% of matches actually being solo queue only, meaning 4 solo players. In 2019, we got a small update that the player base was still split equally between solo queue and SWF, but nothing about match distribution, so we can only assume that it was still around 70%. Now, keep in mind, this information is now nearly a decade old. We've been in a significantly more competitive version of DBD for years at this point. Solo queue has become significantly more miserable for a huge chunk of the player base.
I completely agree with this. I've actually heard this plenty of times, plenty of times. When I have discussions like these, when I talk about changes and stuff like that, even in comment sections nowadays, you'll see everyone bring up the, oh, but solo queue sucks, so therefore the balance, you know, therefore the balancing shouldn't be that way. But we have to take into account that we're trying to balance across the board. We can't just balance for solo queue, especially with the mere fact that they are still teammates, regardless of it being solo queue, regardless if they're bad teammates. They're still your teammates. They can still provide value in different ways. And a lot of the time, it's not necessarily your own fault, but just the people that you ended up matching with. And honestly, as I've also wanted to state a couple of times in the past, was that it's not ultimately your fault if your teammate is the one that is not skilled or making a bunch of blunders. And then that isn't the killer's fault either. You know, it's ultimately just who you matched with, and if you're gonna yell at anybody, yell at them, you know, to be honest.
And the huge addition of MMR, which, speaking of MMR, which is your hidden rank used for matchmaking, if you don't know, don't forget that SWFs have an enormous MMR gain modifier, meaning when a SWF escapes in a match, the MMR system gives them way more MMR gain than if they were playing alone and escaped.
You know, if this was true, if it is true, um, I'm taking everything that we hear with a grain of salt. But if this is a true thing that occurs, that might explain why all the Swifts end up flying straight to the high level, because of the fact that it raises so high when they win. So what ends up happening is like they're uh in usually they'll say, oh, it's only against high MMR players, and that's probably why, right? Like it's four man's winning, and it keeps on skyrocketing their MMR to that level. That would make sense if that is true, and if that is something that we can verify, or at least something that we can, at least I can say I agree with it, because I've seen that plenty of times. Like coordination isn't usually in solo queue, especially to the degree that a four-man can be, especially with comms. Complete four-man communication efficiency usually is very high. Now, you usually hear other people say that it's not always that way. A lot of the time, they're just kind of messing around, quote unquote. But I do believe that if it is a Swift with doing that, I don't really believe they're going to be winning a lot of their games, depending on how they decide to do that. Now, are there probably Swifts across the board and all MMR levels and all, you know, different points? Of course. But I do think that when people are talking about going against Swifts, they are referring to those teams that are dedicated to win. They team up, they dedicate their matches to running the multiple, you know, second chance perks, multiple gen speed focus, like progression perks, multiple things like that in order to win their games. They're talking about teams that go in either to do that, or they're talking about going against bully squads, which is its own conversation to have. But mainly, what's being referred to here is the idea that they are dedicated to win their games. And then because you're also at high MMR, or if you try to win a lot as well, you're going to end up facing that at those kinds of teams.
Talked about this before. Stream sniping hackers would always boost their MMR in 4-man Swifts because it was significantly faster MMR gain with a new account than if they were doing it alone, and that allowed them to quickly get back up to high MMR so they could go back to stream sniping. So with that information, we know that decent Swifts are going to migrate to higher MMR brackets at a much faster rate than solo queue players. Also, keep in mind, these boosted Swift players will still be in high MMR if they search in solo queue later on, which could explain how a lot of very average players make it into high MMR in the first place.
I will say I agree with that idea as well. I've seen a vast range of players in my time, especially because I've played different characters at different levels of MMR. Now, obviously, there is, like, I think with Killer it's a little bit more varied, because I feel like the MMR kind of shifts sometimes. Because if I'm starting a character that's brand new, a lot of the time I would end up going against people that aren't as high in that sort of skill level compared to characters that I usually use very, very frequently. So if we are going off of that, that might explain a lot, right? Because when you are playing one killer for as long as you have, it might explain why you end up seeing a little bit of some varied sort of levels of skill sometimes. Now, I wouldn't say every time. Now, if it's every time, then maybe it's not high MMR. But sometimes you may see like a mix in your lobby where like a few of them are pretty good, but then you also have like that one person that isn't really that great. So that might be able to explain that as well.
So this entire killers are on copium thing when they're playing against a Swift, it's very disingenuous, because chances are it is a Swift, especially if that killer is in high MMR. Now you might ask, why wouldn't Behavior just release some updated stats on this after nearly a decade? Well, the obvious answer is they probably want to keep the information hidden, right? We know for sure they're still tracking the data internally, but they're keeping it on.
The reason that they're probably going to hide this information is either probably they're doing some testing and they want to try to further, sort of further analyze the game without, having an uproar. Could also be the same reason they hide the MMR, which probably is because it might cause a divide within the community. Even furthermore, I think. And I think it'll create an even worse community, because the community is already known to be very toxic as it is. But I think with the release of something like that might make it even worse because of that. And it's probably like theory wise, it probably would have to be due to be like, sort of the, I don't know. I mean, I figure that the community would find a way to make it a shameful conversation. Anyway, they're most likely hiding this data, and they have shown that they aren't going to display certain forms of data until very long. Now, obviously, they just released stats for ourselves. Obviously, that has nothing to do with MMR. That has nothing to do really with anything, right? And especially because people will now use the stats to try to claim that they are better than they really are. Now, keep in mind as well, like there is this thing that people maybe are not aware of, is the fact that the less you play a character, the higher your stats will be. So if you play, say, a survivor and you escape 1 or 2 games in a row, then it'll say your escape rate is like 90 to 100. But if you're playing a killer consistently, you have more games for it to start covering an average. So your average will then decrease because of across all your games. So say if you've been playing a character for like say 3,500 hours, it's definitely going to look very different than somebody who has a killer with 30 hours on that particular killer. The data is going to look different. That's just how math works. Especially when it's kind of like the way that they're doing that kind of data. That makes complete sense.
Under wraps, so let's try to break down why that might be. The first reason is community backlash. If they show that the vast majority of matches have SWFs, then killers are going to start demanding balance changes around that, right?
I agree with that too. I think that not only like what I had mentioned earlier, which there will be some kind of divide in the community even further than already is, but then Choy makes a very good point here where he mentions that now the killer community is going to start now wondering like not only the division, but now they're going to be like, where's our buffs now? Because everything we've been saying has been proven true by the data shown, and they can't have that.
Killer, that is a legit possibility, but then again, if the stats are volatile, they could just show us all the data so we could account for region and time of day or whatever else there is. If they know it's volatile, then that means they have the data, so just go ahead and show it. That said, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Behavior would rather saw off their own legs than ever consider some kind of reasonable nerf to SWF, and anything that might promote public opinion into demanding a SWF nerf is DEFCON 5 levels of fear for the company.
That's something that I really am thinking a lot about. Why is the idea of nerfing SWF or nerfing teams or nerfing them kind of things to balance it out for everybody a bad thing? Right? It seems like behavior, or at least DBD as a whole, is sort of stuck in this weird seesaw of being a party game, but also being a balanced competitive game, sort of back and forth. And I think they're struggling with the scale in terms of how to put it in the right spot in a lot of ways. Because I do think that when something has longevity like this, and isn't just like Mario Party or something, or you just a new one drops every other year or something like that, and you don't really have to really worry as much about it because the next installment will be different. When a game like this is when people are playing it a bunch and you got all sorts of different players and skill levels and stuff like that, and a lot of people are trying to sort of demand for different things, I think that obviously is what makes the balancing so difficult. On the other hand, I think that if they were trying to push it into some kind of framework of what they want it to be, then I think that also will mean that they'll kind of box themselves in over the years, and then they won't be able to be flexible with how they want their game to go. So I think that that's why they're probably being a little bit specific with how they're trying to do these changes. Now, as for changing the SWFs, I'm not entirely sure what the downside of that would be. I don't think you're going to push away anybody, especially because if surviving with friends is literally the idea is that you're loading up with your friends, you're hanging out, and you're just playing the game for fun, and that's what its intention is for at the very least. Then those people, and if that is the vast majority, those people that are playing that casually would just continue to do so. I don't think that it will affect them that much. because ultimately they're going in for a casual experience to have fun. Meaning that the more stress, sort of gen rushy, sweaty, focused players are going to be affected. Which how much of that is the community? I mean, it seems like people who scream the loudest are the most casuals, right? Like they always are saying that, you know, why are you sweating, yada yada yada, why are you tunneling and using strategies, you know, whatever have you, because for some reason, keeping in mind that how, like, sort of the idea is how much of the SWFs is like sweaty teams and how much of it is the casuals. And we obviously are not going to know that. But are they concerned with that sort of group? Is the data so crazy for these SWFs that they are, if they do anything to them, it's going to affect their player base? Like, I'm not really sure.
If 50% of your player base is choosing to play in a SWF, the last thing you would ever want to do is upset the gravy train, right? A good example of this is the recently deceased Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, which at launch allowed you to see the team compositions of who was in a pre-made group, and as you may have guessed, the vast majority of every lobby had a pre-made group in it. And this was such a problem that the devs patched this feature out of the game because solo players would dodge every pre-made lobby to the point where the game became virtually unplayable. The TCM devs also banned SWFs outright from playing their new mode Rush Week because they knew that that would break the balance of the game mode and they just didn't want to deal with it. But overall, I don't want this video to if the vast majority of matches truly have SWFs, then wouldn't that mean that SWF isn't actually as strong as people think they are? Because if that were the case, then survivors would have like a 70% escape rate, right? But in my opinion, this actually makes a lot of sense. The problem isn't inherently SWF, it's optimized SWFs. Groups that pick 4 great survivor players and optimize their builds to counter every possible situation in the game. And the fact that SWF escape rates are not that much higher than solo queue just basically shows that the stats are being dragged down by inoptimal SWFs, kind of in the same way that Nurse usually has an extremely low kill rate, right? Finally, a message for behavior directly. I think most of us in the DBD community would appreciate way more transparency.
I will say though, I do think that completely makes sense. I do think that the idea that the vast majority, and this might also solve the question as to why Nurse has such a low kill rate. We have to keep in mind that people that are actually genuinely good at the game are most likely a very small minority of the community in comparison to people that play casually or not very good or as good as they think they are. So, with that being said, that would then explain why Nurse would have a low kill rate, because people that are very good at Nurse or have mastered Nurse are most likely going to be a much lower number than people learning Nurse or people trying to get to that level with Nurse in the first place, or people who have never touched Nurse in the first place and decided to try them out. Which all of those people most likely would then add to the data that her kill rate's low, because if they're struggling to use her ability or they're still trying to understand how to use her ability, then there means that they're gonna probably have less kills on average just because of the sheer amount of numbers and going off the same data that it would work, as I mentioned earlier. So that most likely would explain the low sort of stats for the SWFs that we have here. The optimized SWFs are probably much less common than it is for the more casual SWFs overall. And the thing is that when we talk about SWFs and we talk about those kinds of things, we're referring to the strength that 4 players can bring. And just because the vast majority may not know how to play effectively does not mean that it is impossible or that it shouldn't be touched. You know, this discussion has been talked about before with different things, and people just believe that because they don't know how to play correctly or because they don't know how to play optimally, that it's impossible for either, you know, for the perk to be fully utilized to the strongest point and be changed because of it. And I think even furthermore, I think with when people are ranking killers too, I think they do the same thing. I don't believe that they fully understand or at least fully can grasp the strength of a character and then they just rank them low. So yeah, hopefully some of this made sense. I feel like I was yapping for quite a while, but either way, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, subscribe to the YouTube things. Original video will be linked in the description for Choy. You can watch the video there, watch his other videos. You can watch my videos as well. We'll put them up on the screen. And let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Do you agree or disagree with any of these points? And yeah, I want to know your thoughts. Follow on Twitch to watch me play Killer live, and I'll see you guys in the next video.